In 2009, one of my students said to me, I was conceived through IVF, and I want to do my senior thesis on the church's teaching about it. Immediately I said yes, knowing that there could be some difficult conversations ahead. But I wasn't too worried, because I knew this young woman could handle them. She had courage. In the end, she produced an excellent thesis on the church's teaching, expressing gratitude that she had been given life and recognizing the moral problems with the circumstances in which she was conceived, not the least of which was the fate of her brothers and sisters, who were never implanted. I encouraged her during that time to reflect on her identity as someone conceived through this technology, but she didn't want to go there, at least not in her senior thesis. And who could blame her? Artificial reproduction raises lots of issues that people don't want to talk about. Infertility affects spouses at their deepest level. Some can question the purpose of their existence if they can't have children. They might feel inadequate, unworthy, unwomanly, unmanly. They can worry that they've done something wrong to cause their own infertility, such as past diet or drug use, including oral contraception, or lack of physical fitness, or you can imagine what we might think of if we're worried and frustrated about things like this. They can fear the judgment of others if they were to use artificial reproduction, controversial as it is, especially if the technology is used to select their favored characteristics for the child. They could worry about the long-term effects of in vitro conception on the child's identity, psychology, or physical development. Spouses can feel conflicted about the irresistible desire to have a child of their own, a selfishness that could lurk beneath their desires, and an intuition that they should be able to rise above their disappointment, shift their focus to other worthy purposes in their lives and for their marriage. So it's no wonder that spouses suffering from infertility avoid talking about these delicate issues, even with each other, and end up feeling isolated and fear more social isolation without the child-related connections to other families, like all the sports and the music and all this and all the way families connect with each other through their kids. Artificial reproduction then seems to be about a challenging but realistic and available way out. Some couples may even find the physical, emotional, and relational challenges to be an experience of personal growth. Hard to imagine, but I imagine the stories are out there. Going through cycles of in vitro fertilization, the most popular form of artificial reproduction, they'll wrestle with the uncertainty of whether it'll work or how long it will take. And beneath that uncertainty is a lack of control. The fact that their bodies won't do what they want, and that the medical treatments make the woman feel physically and emotionally uncomfortable, to say the least. Sometimes couples can find that they were not fully informed about medical treatment and possible medical and psychological side effects. And they can perceive insensitivity and even dehumanizing attitudes in the healthcare staff. There's a lot of human values and features of what it means to be a person that come up in these situations of infertility and reproductive technology. And just as infertility can affect a couple deeply, the responses to infertility available in a society can affect that society deeply. In other words, everybody who can have kids or not, or never wanted to have kids, or is celibate, also affected. In particular, these responses reflect a variety of views found in society of what it means to be human. In a nutshell, if you think that the person is a union of a body and soul, with a spiritual dimension present from the beginning of that person's existence, then you recognize a real human presence in the embryo. By contrast, if you think that a person is simply matter, material, an animated body without a transcendent spirit, you're likely to hold that the embryo is an initial stage of human development that could be stopped without injustice to a real person. Well, following the gospel, the church recognizes the dignity of every human being, every individual person from conception to natural death, and recognizes the spouse's passionate desire for children. So the church resists any technology that exposes the embryo to harm or death, and promotes any technology that heals the body and otherwise addresses the causes of infertility. By contrast, artificial reproduction exposes the embryo produced to death and manipulation, bringing it into existence in a place, a laboratory container, where it cannot possibly survive without another human intervention that transfers the embryo to the womb of its mother or another woman. So one of the fundamental challenges of Christians is to help those suffering from infertility to recognize the dignity of the embryos that they could produce and choose instead to try a method that heals their bodies. Then they can better attempt the mission that is uniquely theirs, to beget children, or perhaps to shift their hearts to another call within their vocation to marriage. Well, this challenge is particularly difficult. Too difficult, in fact, without God's grace and providence, which He offers to all. But it is needed because it asks us to understand deeply, truly and accurately the features and values of the human person. It asks us then to show how some responses to infertility compromise human dignity. Finally, it asks us to communicate, by teaching in our own example, both the features and values of human dignity and how our social practices fall short. So what makes St. John Paul II a good guide? Firstly, he was a radically converted Christian disciple who was unafraid to bring the gospel's ancient wisdom to bear upon our modern problems. He's a good role model for every modern Christian. Secondly, JP2 became that radically converted disciple through the practice of prayer, learned early in adulthood, that put him in a deep, lifelong conversation with God. Thirdly, he had a brilliant, well-trained philosophical mind, which he used to evaluate the strengths and the weaknesses of modern culture. Fourthly, he was a pastor and a mentor who personally experienced as well as counseled others through the challenges of today's Christian life. Finally, his teaching, guided by prayer, synthesized the gospel, the Catholic tradition, modern thought, and pastoral practice into an effective way of following Christ at the dawn of the third millennium. And we're now 25 years in. Notably, his teaching included a close attention to what we call in the philosophical world human subjectivity. Like the subject of a sentence, we are actors in the drama of our own lives. Our thoughts and actions matter, and they matter because they shape our interior lives, our characters. And they matter because they shape our growth in holiness through grace, as well as the circumstances of our lives in which we continue to live. John Paul continually asks, what effect inside us of our own actions, as well as on our environment, the world around us? His approach to understanding the human person has been particularly effective for understanding our modern identities, connecting our joys and suffering with truth and love, and for recognizing our growth in holiness that God achieves within us. And that's particularly relevant for connecting the recognition of human dignity of the spouses and the embryos with the desire for children, the sorrow of infertility in societies that practice artificial reproduction. So where to start? Well, the first thing to say on the issue of artificial reproduction is that the children brought into the world by this technology are good. They bear God's image, just like every other human person who existed or will ever exist. They're destined for redemption of the body, and they're given some great earthly calling. The moral problem is with the circumstances in which they were conceived. And there are always some kind of problems with the circumstances in which a person is conceived. In fact, if a couple waited for the conditions to be perfect, they'd never have children at all. But we can recognize some seriously challenging, personal, practical circumstances, such as poverty, that can rightly motivate spouses to avoid pregnancy. We can also recognize manifestly unjust circumstances, like adultery, that do not respect the dignity of the child brought into the world. And artificial reproduction is one of those last examples, a manifestly unjust situation or circumstances. So there's a tragic contradiction in the practice of human artificial reproduction that is present every time the technique is used, millions and millions of times. This contradiction inevitably influences how we view ourselves as human persons. On the one hand, human life is of such great value that bringing life into the world is a great act. On the other hand, the mass production and destruction of embryos makes the value of these embryos seem cheap. And each one of us started out as an embryo. So, are we cheap or are we valuable? Psalm 8 responds to this question, acknowledging that we can feel cheap, but in fact have been created valuable. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars which you have set in place, what is man that you are mindful of him, and the son of man that you care for him? Yet you have made him little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. You have given him dominion over the works of your hands. Whenever we feel cheap, it's not the way we were created, but may very well have something to do with our earthly experience, including the way we use technology, or as the Bible says, with the way we exercise dominion over the works of God's hands. New technologies sometimes provoke fascination and wonder, sometimes disquiet and unease, and sometimes both. The clearest, most obvious recent example of fascinating, disquieting technology is artificial intelligence, AI. Like artificial intelligence, artificial reproduction provokes our consciences, making us ask, how should people use it? Or should anyone use it? Just as I ask my student conceived through IVF about its effects upon her, let me ask you to consider the effects upon you of this practice and the rest of our society. Now, St. John Paul II was no technophobe, but he was concerned about that the consciences of people, especially in wealthy, free societies like ours, would become darkened and deadened by the misuse of technology. For example, he wrote, if, as a tragic obscuring of the collective conscience, an attitude of skepticism were to succeed in bringing into question even the fundamental principles of the moral law, the democratic system would be shaken to its foundations. When our consciences become darkened, they lose the ability to form moral judgments, and then lose the ability to even see the moral relevance of what happens around us in our societies, and ultimately lose the ability to know God. Some might welcome this last effect, the loss of the ability to know God, as liberation from outdated religious traditions. But if God indeed exists and is a loving God who acts in favor of humanity, in our favor, the darkening of conscience is also a loss of love. And without love, we human persons do not really know ourselves. So there is much at stake. For a couple of years at the beginning of our marriage, my wife and I knew what it was like to fear that we could not have children. We were married in 2001, and our oldest of 3 daughters born in 2004. For the first year of marriage, there was no sign we could have children. We knew that we would not use IVF. We did use hormone support therapy and, of course, did not know if and how it would work. So naturally, we ask ourselves, what would it like to be married and not have children? Knew enough to know that it would be difficult, but would not know how we would handle it. And who would, until you actually go through it? Not saying that one can't prepare for it, prepare for the possibility, and people preparing for marriage should. But also to know actually how you would handle it requires some experience. During the second year, we had the excitement of a pregnancy, but it ended in miscarriage. Again, we had to ask ourselves how we would handle infertility, but this time after imagining the life of the child we had conceived, but whose life had ended after only a few weeks. The suffering of infertility spotlights prominent features and values of each one of us as human persons. First, it shows the strength of a couple's desire for children. The desire for the intimacy of the parent-child relationship, especially when the kids are young. It shows the desire to participate in that great project of raising up the next generation. Unfortunately, some people feel shame, often misplaced shame, as if they have fallen short of some expected accomplishment or have disappointed themselves and others. St. John Paul II takes us far beyond these obvious experiences to understand deeply the features and values of the human person revealed by experiences such as infertility. John Paul observes that each one of us is a unique, unrepeatable individual. Being an individual, each one of us in his or her inner life experiences solitude, loneliness. Think of Adam in the story of creation, where famously John Paul II draws much of this through his own prayer and meditation. Adam felt solitude when he looked around and found himself surrounded only by animals and not another human being. The experience of solitude in all of us prompts a recognition. I am alone but made for others, and others for me. So again, imagine Adam sitting in solitude and thinking, but I exist for someone, and someone exists for me. Then God creates Eve, who also experiences solitude and yearning. Then he and she arrive at that joy-filled moment when loneliness tips over into togetherness. Adam exclaimed, "She is flesh from my flesh and bone of my bones." Well, there's a similar moment when a wife realizes she's pregnant, tells her husband. They realize they're no longer alone, but have a child. For a couple suffering infertility, they fear, or perhaps know, that this moment cannot come. They're together in their own generation, but not in the next one. They can't look forward to a certain kind of familiar experiences that they probably experienced, but as a child. The satisfaction of collaborating parent and child in projects large and small, with the parent teaching the children all kinds of skills, relationship skills, and recognizing their talents and showing them good habits. The joy of simply being together, which shines brightly at birthdays and religious celebrations. St. John Paul II also noticed that human flourishing comes from reciprocal self-giving. That is, each person discovers and learns to use their gifts and discovers themselves as a gift and uses their gifts and their time to serve others. Parents give their child insights into his or her talents, how to develop them. And doing so, the parents get satisfied of having taught the skills and the knowledge and the wisdom that will guide their child for decades. In those future decades, the child develops the ability to take care of themselves and then others, including their own children and their parents. Reciprocal self-giving. At a deep level, infertility calls these features of values of human life into question and the sadness and suffering can be overwhelming. The thought of John Paul II has something to say to suffering and to hope in the face of such difficulties that his thought has helped us to see with greater depth and clarity. John Paul always keeps before our eyes that the primary goal of each human life is to see God in the world and find ourselves to be creatures beloved by him. With that emphasis on human subjectivity, John Paul helps us to see what it's actually like on the inside to be a person seeking and finding God and finding oneself. And the late Pope is particularly good at teaching people to seek God and to find oneself when living in a society full of exciting and powerful technology. Navigating this relationship between discipleship and technology was in fact the starting point for his most influential teaching, The Theology of the Body. At the end of that work, noting that modern technology continually challenging us with two difficult tasks at once. One, to direct technology toward authentically good ends, and two, to direct all the movements of our interior lives toward real, lasting human happiness. Since we use technology to make our lives happier, there's always a boundary to navigate between how we direct our interior lives and how we use technology. When a young couple begins to suspect or comes to know that they cannot conceive children through their own sexual act, this ordinary daily challenge becomes very high stakes. So how can we work out the boundary between a use of technology that inspires our interior life and one that undermines it, now or later, or both? If a form of reproductive technology destroys some human lives in order to serve others, it's a clear sign that it undermines the lives even of those it serves. In the development and ongoing practice of IVF alone, the billions of embryonic human beings have died and continue to die. Unsurprisingly, social science research finds that some people who have used IVF feel overwhelmed by guilt, anxiety, and sadness about their spare embryos, which in a roundabout way shows the value of those embryos' existence. Similarly, the fear of conflict in the relationship, brought first by suffering infertility and then by what to do with one's spare embryonic children, not to mention the rigors of going through the uncertainty and loss of control in the cycles of IVF, shows the value of their relationship, again, in a roundabout kind of way, something they don't want to lose, but struggle to maintain. Artificial reproduction shows prominent features and values of the human person. There's our desire to do something, to overcome serious obstacles. There's our fascination with understanding our bodies and devising powerful tools to adapt it to our benefit. And perhaps some of you have seen those videos of the sperm and the egg meeting and the fascination of seeing the very beginning of a new individual human being. And I can easily imagine the technicians in an IVF clinic having that fascination as they do their work. And before those technicians ever had that job, scientists who developed IVF studied the embryo and experienced the wonder of that beginning of that individual human life. At least I hope they did. Because being present at the beginning of a new human life and not experiencing that fascination and wonder is a disturbing and reflects the deadening of conscience that St. John Paul II so often called out. We see another feature of humanity when this fascination is tinged with moral distress. Sometimes the thing that fascinates us is surrounded by actions which undermine us. This is why my student felt not only gratitude for her own life, but also a sense of loss at the lives of her brothers and sisters. In IVF, the embryos are brought to existence in a place, a laboratory container, leaving them completely vulnerable, dependent upon the decisions of a technician and the parents. From the perspective of a technician, it's easily understandable why IVF protocols create more embryos than needed. We naturally like to increase the chances of our success, especially with lots of money involved. But from a human perspective, the uneasy implication is that any one of these embryos could be the one brought to term in the womb of the mother, given birth, and raised. Now, consider the outcomes of losing this human perspective. St. John Paul II was particularly perceptive in spotting the bad outcomes at spiritual depth. He wrote, "The value of life can today undergo a kind of eclipse, even though conscience does not cease to point to it as sacred and inviolable, by using innocuous medical terms which distract attention from the fact that what is involved is the right to life of an actual human person." These words from the encyclical Evangelium Vitae speak directly of elective abortion, the tragic situation in which the life of a child in the womb is ended and called a, quote, termination of pregnancy. But the same words apply to embryos not implanted in the womb, called spare embryos, and discarded. Gone from this language and people's consciousness is the awareness that God is involved in the creation of each of these embryos. Gone is the awareness that God is present to each of those persons. And gone is the awareness that God is also present to their parents and present to the technician who managed their conception. Again, John Paul II is particularly perceptive at spotting how this loss of the sense of the presence of God in one area of life leads to that loss in other areas of life as well. When the sense, and here I'm quoting his words, when the sense of God is lost, there's also a tendency to lose the sense of man, of his dignity, and of his life. In turn, the systematic violation of the moral law produces a kind of progressive darkening of the capacity to discern God's living and saving presence. Well, in response, what do? Christians seek a progressive enlightening of conscience and the capacity to discern God's living and saving presence, and then to communicate that presence so that any person of goodwill can see it. John Paul asks us to look again at the body through the lens of Scripture and observe that God created the body to be at home in the world. Returning to the story of creation, John Paul notes, quote, "When the first man exclaims at the sight of woman, 'She is flesh of my flesh and bones of my bones,' he seems to say, 'Look, a body that expresses a person.'" John Paul is speaking about how the spouses look at each other's bodies and see not just a body, but a woman entirety, a man entirely. John Paul is writing about fertility, but his insight applies to infertile couples as well. But this time, the spiritual move is to recognize the person through the body and both as a gift, the body and the person as a gift, even a body that cannot have children. So I've offered these reflections to spark our conversation about the features and the values of the human person that are called forth by artificial reproduction and by one of its underlying problems, infertility. The experience of infertility makes us very aware of a couple's desire for children. John Paul II's insights make us very aware that having children is yet another act of creation by which God overcomes the spouse's loneliness, provides a new communion of persons in the family. But an infertile couple confronts in a very intense way the challenge that every modern person, all of us, confront daily: how to direct our interior lives and our use of technology in an authentically loving way. The common experience of joy and suffering offers the possibility of solidarity, and the teaching example of St. John Paul II offers modern disciples a model of how you do it.